When historians compile the roll call of Spain's worst monarchs, one name rises to the top every single time. Scholars do not debate it. Every researcher, every chronicler, every diplomat who left notes about his reign agrees. No one was more corrupt, more cruel, or more depraved than Ferdinand VII. But the truth is far uglier than the polished tales of noble dynasties and secret marriages you've been taught. What passes for royal dignity in the history books was, in this case, nothing but a mask, an elaborate lie woven to disguise a nightmare inside the palace walls. Ferdinand VII did not simply wear a crown. He turned Spain's royal court into a theater of humiliation and horror. He is remembered not only as el rey felon, the felon king, but as a monarch whose private life was so grotesque, so medically bizarre, that it bled into politics and scarred an entire nation's destiny. Even his own mother-in-law once wrote that he was not even a man. Royal physicians, foreign envoys, and even the terrified young brides forced into his bed left testimonies that agree on one thing. Ferdinand's anatomy and appetites created a reign of dysfunction unmatched in European monarchy. What you are about to hear is not just a tale of politics or power. It is the story of how sexual deformity, obsession, and cruelty at the highest level twisted the fate of Spain itself. And it begins in October 1819, inside the royal palace of Madrid, on a wedding night so catastrophic that even the Pope had to intervene.
October 1819. Inside the royal palace of Madrid, a terrified teenage bride waited in silence. Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, only 16 years old, sat trembling in her wedding chamber. She had been raised in a convent, shielded from even the most basic truths of the world. To her, baby still arrived by miracle or by myth, carried in the wings of angels or delivered by storks. Her attendants, German ladies too embarrassed to explain the realities of marriage, simply dressed her in white, placed a rosary in her hands, and left her alone. She prayed in innocence, whispering hymns until the heavy doors opened. But what entered was no fairy tale prince. Instead, a bloated 35-year-old man appeared, his lips thick, his face puffy with disease, his eyes sharp and predatory. This was Ferdinand VII. And yet his appearance was not what froze the young queen with terror. The true horror lay beneath his robes. Ferdinand suffered from a grotesque condition modern medicine still struggles to categorize: macrogenitosomia, a deformity that left his body monstrously disproportioned. Eyewitnesses recorded the details with clinical disgust. French writer Prosper Mérimée described it with disturbing clarity. Thin as a wax taper at the base, as thick as a clenched fist at the end, and long as a billiard cue. Now imagine the scene. A sheltered convent girl, innocent and unprepared, confronted with that nightmare on her wedding night. Maria Josepha bolted from the bed, screaming in blind panic. Ferdinand, drunk on wine and rage, chased her clumsily around the chamber. Picture it, a grotesque monarch swollen with age and indulgence, stumbling after a child bride who ran for her life across marble floors. When he failed to catch her, his humiliation turned to fury. Naked, his deformity on full display, he stormed into the hall and bellowed at the attendants. He cursed them as animals, demanding they prepare the queen within 15 minutes or face his wrath. These women, maids, companions, even the queen's sister-in-law, were forced to calm the trembling girl, to explain in whispers what her husband intended. Whatever they told her only deepened the nightmare. When Ferdinand returned, ready to enforce his rights, he was met not with submission, but with the unmistakable stench of fear. Maria Josepha, overwhelmed by terror, had soiled herself. The King of Spain found his wedding bed stained with human waste. Disgusted, he recoiled, muttering that queens do not possess the fragrance of civet, and stormed out of the chamber. For more than a week, he refused to touch his bride. It was only the beginning of her torment.
To understand why Ferdinand's wedding night collapsed into disaster, we need to look beneath the royal robes. What the young queen saw was not just a husband. It was a deformity so extreme that doctors themselves left written confessions of shock. Royal physicians and foreign observers all agreed. Ferdinand's anatomy was an aberration of nature. Dr. José María de la Fuente, one of the king's attending doctors, wrote, "His Majesty possesses a member of such extraordinary dimensions that normal relations are impossible without severe injury to his partner." It wasn't only the size. The shape itself was monstrous. Thin and fragile at the base, grotesquely swollen at the tip, Ferdinand's body was less like a human organ and more like a crude weapon. Mérimée had not exaggerated. It looked like something designed for torture, not for love. And this wasn't a new discovery in 1819. This curse had haunted Ferdinand since his youth. His first marriage, years earlier, had ended in humiliation and tragedy. At just 17, he wed his cousin, Maria Antonia of Naples. On their wedding night, Maria Antonia described her new husband as clueless, awkward, and painfully inept. In her letters, she lamented, "He merely gawks at me, touches me clumsily, and fumbles without knowledge. He does not know what to do." For 11 months, nearly a year, the marriage remained unconsummated. Ferdinand would grow aroused, attempt to mount his bride, then collapse in confusion, unable to complete the act. His deformity made ordinary union a puzzle he could not solve. Maria Antonia's mother, Queen Maria Carolina of Naples, sent desperate letters across Europe. "My daughter weeps nightly. The prince feels nothing. Inducements are useless. This is a calamity." The humiliation reached such depths that a Catholic priest was summoned to the royal bedchamber, not for a blessing, but for providing explicit instruction. A confessor had to teach the future King of Spain how to perform the most basic act of marriage. Eventually, he succeeded, but the cost was horrific. Maria Antonia endured injuries, miscarriages, and years of agony. She died at only 21, her body broken, her letters testifying to the nightmare of life with a deformed prince. The tragedy should have humbled him. Instead, once he finally discovered how to use his curse, it unleashed an obsession. The boy who could not consummate a marriage became a king who could not stop.
When Ferdinand returned to power in 1814, after Napoleon's fall, he was no longer the humiliated prince of his youth. He was 30 years old, diseased, frustrated, and armed with absolute authority. What followed was not governance, but a carnival of depravity. Every night, cloaked in black, the king slipped out of the palace to haunt Madrid's brothels. His favorite den of vice was run by a notorious madam, Pepa la Malagueña, a woman whose establishment was so infamous that decent citizens crossed the street rather than walk past its doors. But Ferdinand did not wander alone. He gathered a circle of young noblemen, aristocrats as corrupt as himself, who reveled in his nightly hunts. Together, they turned the red light district into a grotesque parody of courtly life with the king at its drunken, leering center. Here, the deformity that once shamed him became a weapon of pride. Witnesses described the same revolting spectacle again and again. The King of Spain, drunk on cheap wine, stripping before his companions and demanding measurement contests. Each man exposed himself, comparing size, while Ferdinand laughed and paraded his grotesque anatomy like a royal badge of honor. He always won. His friends, with twisted humor, nicknamed him El Bien Dotado, the well-endowed one. But Ferdinand's pride did not stop at exhibition. He cultivated a fetish so disturbing it darkened even the brothel walls. Count José María de Villalobos recorded his boast. "They leave my bed certain no man can rival my pleasure, and what I treasure most, keeping the rags stained with proof of their innocence." Yes, the king collected bloodied sheets. Not as evidence, not as ritual, but as trophies. Each stained cloth marked another conquest, another victim reduced to a piece of his grotesque collection. While Queen Maria Isabel labored to build Madrid's cultural crown jewel, the Prado Museum, her husband was curating a private archive of horror, a museum of violated innocence hidden within the palace. And his cruelty was not confined to prostitutes. Wherever Ferdinand traveled, he left a trail of ruin. A widow in Aragon, a peasant girl in Sassuan, palace servants who had no power to refuse their king. Each encounter ended the same way: another rag, another trophy, another scar added to Spain's shame. Meanwhile, the kingdom itself rotted. The empire in the Americas slipped away. Reformers were hunted and executed by the thousands. The economy collapsed under his negligence. Yet Ferdinand cared nothing. His throne was a stage for indulgence. His nights were reserved for brothels, trophies, and humiliation. This was no longer a monarch. This was a predator with a crown.
In 1816, Ferdinand faced the same problem that haunted every monarch without an heir: dynastic survival. His solution was as grotesque as the man himself. He married his own niece, Maria Isabel of Braganza. Maria Isabel was 19, plain-featured, Portuguese, and penniless by royal standards. The gossips of Madrid were merciless, mocking her arrival with a cruel rhyme: feia, pobre y portuguesa, ugly, poor, and Portuguese. But she carried something her husband lacked: dignity. While Ferdinand spent his nights prowling brothels, Maria Isabel tried to bring culture to a court drowning in filth. She founded the Prado Museum, supported artists, and offered refinement where her husband offered shame. To Ferdinand, however, she was nothing more than a vessel, a womb tasked with delivering the heir he so desperately needed. In 1818, she became pregnant, and hope flickered through the court. But what should have been a celebration turned into a spectacle of horror. Complications began immediately. The child was breech. Maria Isabel was fading fast. The physicians had to choose: save the mother or attempt to save the child. Ferdinand did not hesitate. "Save the child. Cut her if you must," he commanded. 12 witnesses later confirmed what followed. The surgeons began an emergency cesarean, slicing open the queen's abdomen without modern anesthesia. Only opium and alcohol dulled the edge. They believed her unconscious. She was not. Halfway through the procedure, Maria Isabel's eyes flew open. A scream tore through the palace halls, raw and blood-curdling. She was fully awake as the blades cut into her womb. The doctors panicked, but continued their brutal work as the queen thrashed in agony. The child was already dead, had been for hours. Maria Isabel bled out on the table. Her last moments spent in unspeakable torment, sacrificed on the altar of dynastic desperation. She was only 21. Whispers spread quickly. Some blamed Ferdinand's deformity, others his syphilis, acquired through years of brothel excess. The queen's own sister declared publicly that her death lay at the king's feet. But Ferdinand showed no remorse. Within a year, he was already searching for a new bride. The kingdom had lost a queen. He had lost nothing.
Remember Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, the terrified girl who soiled herself on her wedding night? That humiliation was only the beginning. After their disastrous first encounter, Ferdinand refused to touch his teenage bride for over a week. When he finally returned to her chamber, she resisted with a ferocity no one expected. The convent-bred child turned into a wildcat. She bit, scratched, and even kicked him in his grotesque anatomy with such force that the king staggered away howling. But defiance could not last forever. Ferdinand was the king. Maria Josepha was his property. He changed tactics, no longer brute force, now patience. Night after night he entered her room, finding her on her knees with a rosary clutched tight, praying as if prayer alone could build walls stronger than stone. Her innocence became her armor. She truly believed children were delivered by stalks, and when Ferdinand tried to explain the truth, she accused him of blasphemy. "God would never design so vile a method for creating life," she declared. "You are tempting me into sin."
Weeks turned into months. The court whispered. Ambassadors reported back to their capitals, and Europe laughed. The King of Spain, humiliator of prostitutes, collector of virgin blood, was being rejected in his own bed. Finally, desperate, Ferdinand played his last card. He wrote to Rome. Pope Pius VII, old and weary after surviving Napoleon, opened a letter that must have staggered even him. The King of Spain begged the Holy Father to persuade his wife to sleep with him. The Pope's reply survives in the Vatican archives. With careful diplomacy, His Holiness reminded Maria Josepha that producing heirs was not only permitted but commanded by God. To deny her husband was to deny divine will. And yet, even the Pope's blessing could not erase her terror. Maria Josepha agreed to submit, but only under her own conditions. She would pray the entire rosary before each act. She would keep her eyes closed throughout, and she would imagine the Virgin Mary to protect her purity while Ferdinand did what he wished. Imagine the scene: the King of Spain, drunk on lust, lying beside his teenage wife as she recited Hail Mary, full of grace, over and over. 10 years this ritual lasted. 10 years of rosary-bound, corpse-like duty. And in those 10 years, not a single child was conceived. When Maria Josepha died at 25, officially of fever, the court sighed with relief. Her decade of living martyrdom was over. Ferdinand had failed yet again. 3 wives, 2 dead, no heir.
By the 1820s, Ferdinand was rotting from disease, swollen with age, and mocked across Europe. 3 wives had failed him, 2 were dead, and Spain still had no heir. At 45, he had one last chance. That chance came in the form of his own niece, Maria Cristina of Bourbon II Sicilies. Unlike the innocent brides before her, Cristina was sharp, beautiful, and ruthlessly practical. She knew exactly what she was marrying: a broken man with a crown, a predator with power, and a body that destroyed women. But she came prepared. Maria Cristina understood what others had not. Ferdinand's curse was not just moral, but mechanical. Producing an heir required solving an engineering problem. She turned to the royal physician, Dr. Antonio Hernandez, who studied the king's medical records with grim precision. The doctor's verdict was startling. The problem was not only Ferdinand's monstrous size, but the physics of the act itself. If the tool was too large for the garden, the solution was to alter the conditions. So Hernandez designed a device: a cushion, una almohadilla, sewn from fine silk and stuffed with down feathers. In its center was a carefully measured opening, precisely 4 centimeters deep. The cushion would act as a barrier, allowing only the necessary tip to pass through, sparing the queen from the catastrophic injuries that had destroyed Ferdinand's earlier wives. Cristina presented it with diplomacy worthy of a stateswoman. She framed it not as an admission of deformity, but as a medical necessity to protect the crown's future. Ferdinand's fragile ego, soothed by the idea of royal science, accepted. Their first attempt was awkward. The king who had bragged in brothels was now forced to admit limitation. But Maria Cristina treated the ritual like a political ceremony, formal, clinical, necessary. And astonishingly, it worked. Within 3 months, she was pregnant. On October 10, 1830, cannons thundered in Madrid. Spain had an heir, a healthy daughter, Isabella, the future queen. 2 years later, Cristina bore another daughter, Luisa Fernanda. It had taken 4 wives, 2 deaths, a papal intervention, and a silk cushion to solve the Bourbon succession crisis. But Ferdinand finally had his heirs. And yet with this grotesque success, Spain was thrust toward its bloodiest civil wars. For the birth of Isabella not only changed dynastic law, it doomed the country to decades of conflict.
For years, courtiers whispered about Ferdinand's darkest habit. Some dismissed it as slander, others as drunken gossip. But after his death in 1833, when Maria Cristina ordered a quiet inventory of his private chambers, the truth came out. Hidden in a cedar chest, wrapped in silk, lay dozens of folded cloths, each one stained, each one carefully labeled with a name and a date. Carmen, palace housemaid, March 1821. Isabella, palace servant, January 1823. Maria, widow of Valencia, September 1824. The whispers had been true. Ferdinand had been collecting blood-soaked rags from the virgins he deflowered. Not once, not twice, but for nearly 2 decades. And the pattern revealed something even darker. The dates were not random. They clustered around political crises, after crushed rebellions, after executions, after defeats. Each time Ferdinand signed death warrants by day, he added to his collection by night. One entry froze investigators with horror. Ana, 15 years, daughter of Colonel Bermudez, February 1823.
Colonel Bermudez had been executed for supporting the liberal constitution. His daughter had come to the palace to beg for mercy. She left violated, her innocence reduced to another bloody trophy in the king's grotesque archive. This was not lust. This was policy. Ferdinand used sex as a weapon of terror. Enemies who escaped the gallows saw their families destroyed in the royal bed. Wives, daughters, sisters, all became pawns in a campaign of personal vengeance. Maria Cristina, horrified, ordered the collection burned, but not before multiple courtiers recorded what they had seen. Their testimonies matched too perfectly to dismiss. We will never know how many women Ferdinand destroyed. For every cloth preserved in that chest, how many victims were silenced? How many resisted and disappeared? How many were broken but left unrecorded? What we do know is chilling. The King of Spain, El Rey Felon, did not just collect taxes or lands or titles. He collected human suffering. He turned innocence into memorabilia. And with every blood-stained rag, he stitched cruelty into the very fabric of his reign. By September 1833, Ferdinand VII was a shell of a man, diseased, obese, eaten alive by the very vices that had defined his reign. When death finally claimed him on the 29th of that month, Spain barely pretended to mourn. His own brother, Don Carlos, seized the moment to challenge the throne, declaring that Isabella's succession was illegitimate. In an instant, Ferdinand's last act, the pragmatic sanction that placed his daughter on the throne, plunged Spain into civil war. The Carlist Wars, bloody and unrelenting, would kill hundreds of thousands and fracture the nation for decades. His widow, Maria Cristina, wasted no time scandalizing the kingdom one last time. Within months, she remarried a common palace guard. While the court reeled, she quietly buried the evidence of Ferdinand's darkest perversions, burning his collection of trophies. Yet the whispers could not be silenced. But Ferdinand's true legacy was not political chaos, it was personal ruin. He had transformed the Spanish monarchy from a sacred institution into a grotesque farce. Every royal marriage after him was tainted by suspicion. Every Bourbon heir carried the stain of his shame. Even his own daughter, Isabella II, inherited not just his throne, but his appetites. Her notorious affairs and whispered nymphomania became so scandalous that in 1868 she was driven from power altogether. The dynasty Ferdinand had engineered into existence with silk cushions and bloodied rags collapsed under the weight of its own depravity. Think of that cushion. A king so monstrously deformed that heirs could only be conceived through medical contraptions. A monarchy so desperate that it reduced royal intimacy to an engineered procedure. That silk pillow was more than a tool. It was a symbol of Spain's corruption, a relic of power twisted into pathology. And what did Ferdinand leave behind? Not glory, not greatness, only the memory of a man defined by cruelty, deformity, and humiliation. Historians have called him cowardly, selfish, vengeful. The Duke of Wellington called him the most contemptible of God's creatures. All of them were right, but perhaps none of them were harsh enough.
because Ferdinand VII was not merely a bad king. He was a predator who wore a crown. He collected women as if they were hunting trophies. He turned power into a weapon of the body. And when he died, he left behind not just a broken Spain, but a legacy carved in suffering and shame.
Ferdinand VII wanted history to remember him as El Deseado, the desired one. Instead, he is remembered as the felon king, a grotesque reminder that power without humanity creates monsters. He passed no legacy of greatness, not laws that uplifted his people, not victories that expanded his nation. What he left were burned rags, ruined women, dead queens, and a fractured Spain. His throne was soaked in humiliation, his dynasty poisoned by his own appetites. And maybe that is the cruelest irony of all. Monarchs dream of immortality, but Ferdinand's immortality is this, a cautionary tale whispered across centuries, proof that crowns do not make kings, and power cannot hide deformity of the soul. Because monsters don't always live in forests or under beds. Sometimes they sit on thrones. Sometimes they are celebrated as rulers. And sometimes history unmasks them for exactly what they are. If this story shattered what you thought you knew about royal power, then you need to hear the next one. Tap the video on your screen to discover the tale of the 6-year-old child bride forced to wed a 29-year-old king. A nightmare that proves the horrors of the royal bedchamber shaped history more than any battlefield. And if you found this investigation as compelling as I did, subscribe. Let's keep pulling back the layers of history together. Because forgotten voices deserve to be heard.